This is Nikon's answer to Fujifilm mirrorless cameras, the Nikon Zf. But unlike most of the Fujifilm options which utilize an APS-C size sensor, Nikon have kitted this Zf out with a larger 24 megapixel full frame sensor. So does this mark the beginning of a new rivalry between Nikon and Fujifilm, and is there more to this camera than just retro aesthetics? Well, it's fair to say that over the past few years, Nikon have been at the butt end of endless jokes online, mainly targeted at its range of mirrorless cameras. However, to Nikon's credit, last year we saw the release of two cameras in particular that have somewhat silenced the critics for very different reasons. There was first the Z8 with a list of groundbreaking new technology that could be a serious contender for the likes of Sony and Canon, and then there's the Zf with its classic design being an indication to some that Nikon could be gearing up to clash with Fujifilm. But that's not to say that Nikon is a complete newbie when it comes to making retro style cameras like this, because back in 2021 you'll probably remember that Nikon released the Zf-C, which was a slightly smaller and lighter version of this camera with an APS-C size sensor. And before that, we even had the Nikon Df, which was a retro-inspired DSLR. In fact, it's the company's rich heritage in manufacturing film SLRs which inspired the look of this Zf, with it being modelled quite heavily on the Nikon FM2 film camera, which was a popular choice during the 80s. And as a result, this Zf has inherited not only its good looks, but also some of its mechanical operations too. The most obvious one being the array of manual dials on this top plate. Now, I've got to say, when looking at this camera from the top down, I think it has to be one of the cleanest and most aesthetically pleasing layouts on a camera that I've ever used. Everything is just so neatly arranged, and that means you have quick access to all of the fundamental settings without it feeling cluttered or overly complicated. I really like how the mode dial has been substituted for this switch around the ISO dial. For me, a big modern looking mode dial on the top of a retro looking camera is the first thing that ruins the illusion that you're shooting with something that could pass for a film camera. So this feels like a really nice compromise. On the opposite side of the camera, there are these dedicated dials for shutter speed and exposure compensation. And I should also mention that all three of these dials have been made from solid brass. So just like its ancestor, the FM2, over time as this camera starts to pick up wear and tear, the black finish will inevitably start to rub away and reveal the brass underneath, giving it this beautiful aged look. You can even start to see some of the effects of that on this lone camera here, where obviously somebody from the UK press has decided to use this camera as a football. Now, if you're not a fan of using the classically styled dials on the top, then don't worry, because there are also front and rear command dials too, and this means you can switch these manual dials over to the automatic modes and then adjust them using these two other dials just like you would on a regular digital camera. Now, in between all of these top dials, you may have spotted this small window, which has obviously been designed to look like the small window that you often find on the top of film SLRs that displays how many shots are remaining on your current roll of film. But in this case, it actually denotes the current aperture setting, which I think is just a really nice touch. The camera body itself is fully weather sealed too, and unlike the Zf-C, which felt a little bit hollow and a bit plasticky despite it not actually being made entirely from plastic, this Zf feels as solid as a rock, and if anything, it is a little bit on the weighty side. Now, in some ways, I actually quite like the fact that it's weighty because it feels more like the real deal, but on the other hand, its boxy design does mean that the added weight makes it a little bit more awkward to handle. Now, don't get me wrong, it really isn't terrible, and this subtle notch they've added to the front does go quite a long way to help matters. But if you are planning on using this camera with heavier or larger lenses, then you might need to think about investing in a third-party grip. Now, whilst we're on the topic of lenses, alongside this release, Nikon also produced this special edition 40mm f2, which has been redesigned to look a little bit more retro so that it better complements the aesthetics of this camera. And at first glance, it certainly does a pretty good job of doing that. However, when this thing arrived, I will admit I was pretty disappointed to find out that it's almost entirely made from cheap plastic, and even the lens mount is made from plastic.
Brother, what's that? What's that, brother?
And for a lens that's being paired deliberately with this premium and meticulously designed camera, slapping this cheap plastic lens on the front just feels a little bit cursed to me. Also, maybe it's just me being a little bit picky here, but I feel like Nikon has really missed a trick by not including a manual aperture ring on this lens. Instead, we just get this fake silver plastic ring that kind of fills the void where you'd expect to find one, which is a bit of a shame. Now, during my time with this camera, I also experimented a bit with this brand new Viltrox 56mm f1.7 that I've been sent for testing recently, and although this is technically an APS-C size lens, you can obviously pair it on a full frame camera and it will just activate crop mode. Now, the results I captured with this 56mm focal length ended up looking closer to that of a 85mm lens on a full frame camera, which is perfect for portraits and if you prefer to capture street photography from a distance. But before I get too carried away, there's something else I want to show you, and that's this, the Obsbot Tair Air. Now, this tiny 4K video camera is suited to a whole range range of video types, including vlogging, streaming, or just capturing dynamic tracking shots of yourself without the need to drag along a second camera operator. What's more, the Obsbot Tair Air is packed full of advanced AI features that make it super quick and easy to use, including the use of hand gestures to operate the camera whilst you're in front of it. For example, if I make the OK hand gesture, it'll automatically start recording to the micro SD card. If I show a flat hand, this will activate human tracking mode so that the camera will follow me around the room, and if I want a tighter crop, I can just do this and the frame will crop in and out dynamically. Now, aside from humans, this camera can also track pets and objects too, which can all be controlled wirelessly using the easy-to-use mobile app. This camera can also be used for streaming too, allowing you to link up to 3 Tair Airs together for multicam setups, and you can stream to various platforms like YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook Live via the mobile app, or with NDI support for higher quality streams. When filming out on location, this camera is kitted with a large rechargeable battery, allowing for up to 136 minutes of continuous recording from a single charge. Although there is a built-in microphone, you can also insert an external microphone for increased audio quality using the port on the back. To find out more about the Obsbot Tair Air, be sure to check out the link in the video description below. Anyway, whilst we're on the topic of subject tracking, this ZF actually has some pretty decent autofocus features of its own, including the ability to identify and lock onto people, animals, vehicles, and planes, which all works as well as you would expect. However, if you prefer sticking to the old-fashioned method of moving a single AF point around like I do, then you might be slightly disappointed to hear that there's not a joystick on this camera. You can of course use the touchscreen or the D-pad to move around the AF point, though personally I found that the D-pad is located just a little bit too far down the camera, and this can't be done comfortably using just your thumb. Now, speaking of the screen, this, as I've mentioned, is a pull-out and tilt design, which is obviously handy for shooting at high and low angles. But I have got to admit, I feel like for a camera like this is a little bit overkill, and I would have definitely preferred something a little bit more understated. Now, you can of course just turn this screen over and forget it's even there, which I imagine is what most photography purists will do anyway, which is fair enough. And I'm assuming that they've added this type of screen to help with the video functionality of this camera, because it actually has some pretty impressive video specs, including 4K video capture at 10-bit up to 60 frames per second. I mean, sure, the rolling shutter is pretty horrendous in 4K, but so long as you're not doing any fast panning shots, the image quality is pretty damn decent. Plus, it has up to 8 stops of image stabilization, which obviously means that when you're shooting handheld, your shots are virtually shake-free. Now, I'll admit, one feature on this camera that raised my eyebrow slightly at first was the decision to include a micro SD card slot alongside the full-sized SD card slot, because at first I thought, who in their right mind is using a micro SD card on a camera with specs like this? But actually, I think this could be low-key genius, because micro SD cards are generally super cheap to buy these days, so essentially it allows you to add like 128 gigabytes or higher of internal memory just as a backup or overflow for those times where you're snapping away and you don't realize you're about to fill the main SD card. Anyway, enough about all of that. Let's get on to the real reason why you're probably considering buying this camera, and that's for the photography. Well, inside there's a 24.5 megapixel full frame sensor, which is the same chip that's found on the Z6 Mark II, so the hardware is pretty damn solid. The mechanical shutter allows you to shoot burst images up to 14 frames per second, but you can extend this further up to 30 frames per second using the electronic shutter. Now, when shooting with this camera, I've got to say, the first thing I noticed is the shutter release button is basically a hair trigger. There's really not much resistance between half pressing and fully depressing this button. So at first, I found myself taking a bunch of shots of my shoes by accident. In fact, it happened so frequently that I ended up customizing the button layout so that I could use back button focusing instead, which honestly isn't my usual setup, but it ended up working out pretty well. But by and far, my most favorite feature on this camera is something I really didn't think I would be raving about, and that's the dedicated black and white mode. At first, I'll admit, I just thought that was just a complete novelty, but after I tested it, I found myself almost exclusively shooting in this black and white mode because the images it creates just look beautiful. Plus, if you do what I did and capture the images in both JPEG and RAW, then at least you do have the option to work your images up in color later on using the RAW files, because the RAW files will retain all of the color information. So what about the image quality? Well, it really is as good as you would expect. Obviously, you're going to benefit from Nikon colors if you don't shoot in black and white, which is something I know a lot of people seem to rave about.
You can't park there, sir. How did you manage to get in here? You've been drink driving?
And to be fair, even the raw files I captured look pretty good straight out of the camera. But let's face it, you don't shoot in RAW just to use the images as is. And the good news is that these 14-bit images offer plenty of dynamic range and flexibility in post for pulling back highlights and boosting shadows to reveal bags of detail, which is kind of what you would hope for in a camera that's going to set you back close to $2,000. Which brings me on to my next question. For that price, would I ever consider buying this camera? Well, this is where I am a little bit torn. Before I go on and answer that question, there's not a doubt in my mind that this is a great camera. So what I'm about to say is really just a mix of my own personal preference along with a sprinkle of nitpicking on top. Okay, probably closer to a handful of nits being chucked on top, but just bear with me. Overall, I can't help but feel that this camera is slightly confused. In so many ways, Nikon have just knocked it out of the park with the aesthetics and design of this camera. I mean, if you squint hard enough, this practically looks identical to the original FM2 film SLR design, and I love how much attention to detail has been put into that. But then at the same time, they lump it alongside a cheap plastic lens, which just feels like a total afterthought. I also love how they've made some of the modern features still feel vintage and fit in with the overall aesthetic of this camera, with that little aperture display window thing and the lever style mode selector and the brass mechanical dials. But then flip the camera over and they've slapped a super modern flippy, tilty, pull-out screen design on the back. I guess my overall gripe with this camera is that there are just too many things that kind of break the illusion that you're actually shooting with an analog camera. It's kind of like going to Disneyland, watching one of the shows, and then Mickey Mouse's head keeps falling off. I mean, sure, the cast member can pick it up and put it back on again, but you've already seen behind the veil and the magic doesn't quite feel as real anymore. Ultimately though, if you don't care about having a fully convincing film-like shooting experience and you're just after a camera that looks kind of cool and can capture great photos and video, then this is definitely for you. For me though, this one is a pass, but considering how many improvements have been made to this camera versus the ZF-C, I am super excited to see what Nikon comes up with next in this range of cameras.